certainly in an election year where the kind of common understanding of the two parties, in part, I think remains relatively unchanged over the past 40 years, right? Democrats want higher taxes and more government, and Republicans want lower taxes and less government. That's just the popular trope. I'm not actually commenting on whether that's a fair one or not. But you wrote and have done a lot of work actually looking at the way most people think about actually paying taxes versus this trope. And you've come up with a rather different set of observations. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Americans are actually remarkably proud to pay taxes. And this is a finding that's really consistent over a very long period, 40 years of survey data. And it doesn't really matter how you ask the question. If you ask people, for example, do they think that it is every American's civic duty to pay their fair share of taxes, you get a level of agreement that is almost unheard of. It's 90+%, sometimes as high as 95. I looked into survey data to try and find other questions where you get 95% of Americans agreeing, and you have to ask them things like, is Elvis alive? Or did we land on the moon? So this is really a very, very high level of agreement that taxation is an important civic duty. It's something that people even describe it as patriotic. When citizens are speaking to government officials, they often describe themselves as taxpayers, right? Which is sort of a funny thing to take pride in. It's sort of like saying, I didn't break any laws, right? It's mandatory to pay taxes and everyone does. But it is a really strong sentiment that Americans hold. And you can actually also see it in something called our tax morale, which is a sort of jargony term. But what it means is that compared to people in other countries, Americans are better about paying their taxes than other countries, right? We pay more of our taxes and more of it on time. We pay far more taxes than actually can be explained by the level of enforcement of our tax laws that exist. If you ask people what bothers them about taxes, again, survey after survey after survey will tell you the number one and number two concerns are that corporations and the wealthy aren't paying their share. Those always outscore by something like 3/5 of Americans pick those answers. Then something like 10% of Americans will say the amount that they pay. There's an enormous misconception currently about tax attitudes in this country. And I think that it stems from looking at our politics. But our politics do not represent the attitudes of most Americans.
Does this enthusiasm coming from Americans to pay their taxes, is it because they have faith in what the country is doing, what the government is doing? And I ask that because I am recording here from Greece, where everyone knows it's a huge challenge to get people to pay their taxes. And I always make the assumption it's because people don't trust the government. They don't think that their money is being spent in good ways. So I'm wondering if we could do the reverse extrapolation for Americans, or is it coming from something else?
So trust in government in the United States has declined significantly over many decades. It used to be that most Americans thought they could trust politicians to do what's right most of the time. That was true in the 60s. And it has sort of secularly declined since then. Compared to what Americans have in the past thought about the quality of their government, it is certainly lower. But by a comparative standard, looking at other countries, Americans have a lot of pride in their country and in the institutions of their government, the sort of version of the government you learn about in the, how a bill becomes a law, or, in your high school history class. People have a lot of pride in that.
Most people, when asked, believe or feel like there's something unfair about the tax system whereby the wealthy and the corporations aren't paying their share. And maybe we could separate those two, because it's not like the tax rates or the way in which we calculate taxes for corporations and the wealthy are the same at all, even though they're lumped in kind of popular imagination as a generalizable, I'm paying too much, they're paying too little. That perception of the wealthy not paying their fair share, I mean, the wealthy as an aggregate, right? The top, I think 1% in the United States pay about 45% of all income taxes in the United States. I mean, it is a graduated tax system. Now, we could argue about whether or not billionaires proportionally are paying enough, but usually when people are talking about the wealthy, I mean, maybe I don't know, maybe, illuminate us about this. Are they talking about only the very, very, the 1,000 people who have close to $1 billion or $1 billion, or are they is it like everybody above?
So when Americans talk about the wealthy, it really depends, and it depends how you ask the question. But if you encourage people to think specifically about the extremely wealthy, the sort of billionaire level of wealth, there's a lot of concern there that folks in that bracket aren't paying their share. And that's backed by the data. So if you look at our tax code as a whole, it is marginally progressive. The income tax is quite progressive, but our state and local taxes tend not to be. So on net, if you think about all the taxes people pay, the system is marginally progressive across the range of incomes among people who for most audiences. So, people who don't make very much, people who are, like a doctor or something like that. It's a progressive tax. But at the very top, once you're talking about people who are making millions and billions, the amount of tax they pay is actually lower than people who have less money.
That's a product of tax on capital is lower than the tax on income. If the money that you're living on is primarily a product of gains you've made on your money, then your tax rate is lower. If the money you live on, even if it's, a $10 million salary for the CEO of a bank or a Fortune 500, if that is primarily income, then it is a progressive system.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
That's right. So if you think about, if we could be taxing wealth or we can be taxing work, right? And because we tax work more heavily than wealth, what that means in practice is that people who have to work for a living are paying at this higher rate. And it also means that people who have large stores of wealth, which, for example, is like a deeply racialized category of people, right? Like Black Americans have lower wealth than white Americans. So when we tax wealth less, we're also creating sort of racial inequities.
I think the common narrative on the left when this topic gets brought up is like Republicans, goddamn Republicans, Is that true? I mean, is that like the history? Like it really is just the Republicans became anti-tax, period? Was that always the case? When did that happen? I'd love to hear a little bit about that development.
We have an income tax that is a mass tax, that is to say that most people pay an income tax thanks to World War II, right? This is how Roosevelt decided to raise the kind of money we needed to fight the Nazis. And so we've had a progressive income tax ever since. Before that, there was an income tax, but it was only paid by very rich people. What's interesting is that between the 40s and the 60s, taxes were actually not a particularly controversial subject between the parties. If you look back at old party platforms, Republicans and Democrats alike, they have a couple of sentences about taxes, but it wasn't seen as a major dividing line between the parties. It was a kind of technical issue. People really respected people who had like expertise in how we would handle this very technical, not terribly political issue. And that changes, right? That changes in the 1970s and 80s as Republicans, as you say, become very dedicated to an anti-tax perspective. And that becomes kind of one of the key mobilizers of Republicans and also one of the sort of key like rhetorical tropes of Republican Party politics.
So maybe talk a little bit about the reason Americans, I think in general, are proud to pay taxes because there's a kind of a generic recognition that we have this thing called the commons. I mean, even if there isn't a recognition of calling it the commons, there's this idea that there are shared goods that the market doesn't usually pay for, right? But do people actually think that way, or is it just kind of a more generalizable civic spirit?
So I don't think people have a lot of the rhetoric that you're suggesting, but that doesn't mean they don't have a sense of those ideas. The kind of rhetoric of the commons is something that people don't hear very often, right? So when I ask people, I did interviews with folks about tax paying, and I asked them, what is tax paying like? Like, what activities is it similar to for you? The frequency with which they tell you helping their neighbors, and they'll tell you a really specific story. They'll be like, well, my neighbors across the street, they're getting older, so I shovel the snow out of their driveway for them. I help my neighbor get her groceries up the stairs. And so they tell a story that's about care and community. And often a very, very personal story about care and community, which was interesting for me because sometimes when you talk to people about political issues, you hear a party line or you hear, an advocate's language coming out of a person's mouth, right? And that's, evidence that the advocate or the party is doing a great job reaching the public, right? But on this question, they didn't have an answer in their pocket and they had to think it over as a rule. And, and I thought the sentiments that people brought to bear were really heartwarming, frankly, that they would see this thing that is, this annoying process and inconvenient and so much negative rhetoric about it in politics. But when you ask them what it's like, what they come up with, is something that really is evidence of your contribution, that you're doing your part. And I think that's lovely, frankly.